What if I told you that the most celebrated architects, the ones whose designs win awards and dominate magazines, are the reason why our buildings fail us? Today we are discussing Stewart Brand's book, How Buildings Land. And through it, we'll uncover how the pursuit of beauty and boldness in architecture often leave us with spaces that are unlivable, unadaptable, and unsustainable. And what we, the occupants, can actually do about it. Which is what we're discussing in this episode of Maker Book Guild, a new series where we're talking through books that help us become better humans and makers. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty, I would like to draw a diagram that will help us understand a little bit more of the concepts inside of the books. Stewart Brand proposes that every building has a bunch of what he calls shearing layers, and it initially starts with a site where the building is built, and the most important part of a building is structure. So every building has a structure, kind of like the bones of the building. Then around the structure we put on skin. Then inside of the structure we have services. Then inside of that, the next layer is a space plan. And then inside of the space plan is just stuff, furniture. What's proposed in the book is that these layers tear themselves apart at different rates. And essentially, the site is permanent. The structure typically lasts between 30 to 300 years, in some rare occasions, of course, more. The skin is supposed to last about 20 years. The services last 7 to 20 years, and at which point they might need to be updated. The space plan lasts about 3 years, and finally, stuff, furniture, is under 3 years. Obviously, there's variability inside of that, but that's generally how it is. Now that we have the shearing layers out of the way, let's talk about why do some buildings look so incredible but fail the people who actually use them. Architects often prioritize form over function, chasing prestige and awards over practicality. Especially now in the world where screens and photographs and videos dominate. But even in the times where the book was written in the 1980s, architects were awarded by the visual aesthetic of buildings. So how do these wrong incentives create problems? Well, there's this great example of a building that was actually built more than 20 years after this book was published. It's the Scottish Parliament building in Edinburgh. And that building, I think, was finished in 2003. Initially, the quoted price for this building getting erected was about £10 million, and the price went up to £414 million by the time it was finished. And as you can see here, it's quite a complex design, and it has drawn a lot of attention to itself. It has drawn a lot of tourism. But while this design is architecturally bold, the price that the Scottish taxpayer had to pay for that building is probably not worth it, because not only did it run over budget, but also the yearly maintenance costs are astronomical, as well as eventually in 2019, they needed another roof repair, which cost them £2.1 million to execute because, and this is a recurring theme here, the roofs are the most problematic thing in architecturally bold buildings. They actually tend to cause the most problems because once a roof is compromised and there's a leak, it enters the building and it decreases the lifespan of a building drastically. It damages wood, it damages stone, water is the most damaging thing in buildings. Another example is the Walt Disney Concert Hall, designed by Frank Gehry in Los Angeles. This curved structure is gorgeous. However, what it created is these hotspots around the building everywhere, because the building is made of this material that was really shiny and created these hotspots where some occupants living around the building had to pay more as a result of having to cool down their spaces because of the sun glare that was reflected into their buildings. And on some sidewalks, the temperature would rise up to 60 degrees Celsius. That's crazy. So this problem they actually mitigated by going back and getting rid of the sheen and just dulling the surface. However, buildings of such shapes are really hard to use because there is no straight walls. And inside of a museum, you want a flat wall to hang a painting or to hang some type of art. And those buildings just become really tough to use by its users. Another reason why these artistic buildings are so difficult for users to adapt to their own liking is that they are tough to adapt because they feel so precious. They feel like a piece of art. Imagine that you have a piece of art hanging on your wall and you want to change it ever so slightly to fit the space inside of your house. You won't get that piece of art because that's the way the artist initially designed it to be. Okay, I have one more example where a building didn't meet its functional requirements. And this is the Vitra fire station in Germany. It was initially designed to be a fire station. However, the firemen found this space so unusable that they had to move out and move somewhere else, and they readapted the building for a different purpose. Stewart Brand actually gives a lot more examples within the book, and I would actually urge you to read the physical book. I read it on a Kindle. I got my hands on the physical book, and it's so much better because you can actually view the images. It's a very visual book, so I would definitely recommend you go for the physical book rather than the Kindle, but I read it on the Kindle and it was okay. I still got a lot of value out of it. So part of the appeal of the book is that Stewart Brand gives a lot more examples within the book on how different buildings perform, and he gives a lot of comparisons of good structures versus bad structures. One of the reasons why the author says that architects do what they do and they design the way they design is they see themselves as artists rather than craftsmen. When art is made, it is supposed to be non-functional, it is supposed to be non-practical, it reveres new and despises the traditional, and it sells at a distance. Whereas craft is where a practical function predominates over the aesthetical function. So now that we know what the problems are, how do we build buildings that are sustainable, that are created for its users rather than for viewers outside and gaining rewards? One of the core ideas is that a building is something you start and not something you finish. And there's this beautiful example of long-term thinking, and one of my favorite quotes from the book. New College, Oxford is of rather late foundation, hence the name. It was founded around the late 14th century. It has, like other colleges, a great dining hall with big oak beams across the tops. These might be 2 feet square, 45 feet long. A century ago, so I am told, some busy etymologists went up into the roof of the dining hall with a penknife and poked at the beams, and found that they were full of beetles. This was reported to the college council, who met in some dismay, because where would they get beams of that caliber nowadays? One of the junior fellows stuck his neck out and suggested that there might be on college lands some oak. These colleges are endowed with pieces of land scattered across the country, so they called in the college forester, who had not been near the college itself for some years, and asked him about oaks. He pulled his forelock and said, "We was wondering when you'd be asking." Upon further inquiry, it was discovered that when the college was founded, a grove of oaks had been planted to replace the beams in the dining hall when they became beetly, because oak beams always become beetly in the end. This plan had been passed down from one forester to the next for 500 years. You don't cut them oaks, them's for the college hall. I don't know why I'm doing that accent. A nice story, and that's the way to run culture. And so this story brings me on to the scenario buffered building. And what this idea talks about is that all predictions are wrong. And that is why buildings are something you start, not something you finish. What you don't want to do is over-adapt to current conditions. And so you plan for the extremes. You make as many predictions where a building could go, and you leave an unadapted building. You don't over-adapt to current conditions, and you favor moves that increase options. You use materials which are easily adaptable. You use materials which are locally accessible. Wood that is locally accessible, stone that is locally accessible, materials that are used locally. You add extra services. You leave extra wire in the wall so you can put a receptacle somewhere else. You design different rooms differently. Rooms that are likely to change more often, you make them more adaptable, whereas rooms which might not change as often, you leave less adaptable. It makes sense, but the general idea is to not design the building too specifically, because people's lives change, people come and go as well, and different people want different things out of buildings. So you want to leave those buildings as adaptable as bloody possible. There's this beautiful idea in the book called the vernacular building. And what a vernacular building is, it's a folk design building, something that is common, that is widespread, that is almost ordinary. But what makes this beautiful is that no two communities dwell alike. You go to one part of the world and one type of structure that is designed by current wisdom that is being passed down from one person to the other, versus another part of the world where a building is more adapted to somebody else's way of living. And so things like running water, bathroom, central heating, AC, aren't things that were introduced to buildings by architects, but they were passed down because one person saw somebody else having this great new invention in their house or in their building, and they wanted it for themselves, basically. Another thing that's recommended is for architects to do this thing called post-occupancy evaluation. And it should be done regularly, where architects go back and investigate whether the building they designed is actually comfortable for its occupants. Stewart Brand talks about three different kinds of buildings. We've discussed the first, which is no road, buildings that don't adapt, buildings that are difficult. But there are two more categories, the high road and the low road. Those two categories are of the adaptive kind. And the easiest way to make a building adaptable is the low road. It requires low finances. It actually, the quality of a low road building is that it's cheap and nobody cares what you do in there. Nobody cares that you change something inside, but it's easy to adapt. Rooms are easy to change. Rooms are big and you can divide them up if you want to. You can remove the walls. You can change things the way you want them to be and adapt them to your own liking. The second type of building is the high road. And the high road is a building that requires a lot more care, a lot more time, and it requires a lot more money, a dictator to continue developing it, to continue adapting it to its own liking. There are some beautiful examples of buildings in North America which are high road, which have been continually adapted and taken care of for generations. The way to design a high-row building is to begin with strong structure. You want that structure to last 300 years versus 30 years. And you want the structure to be able to adapt, to take more weight as time passes, so to take on additions. A lot of buildings have been made taller than they originally were, and that's where the structure requires a lot more strength. It grows with time, it grows with stages. A high-row building is a constant work of love, constant refinement. Some great general design ideas proposed by Stewart Brand is that you should have a roof that is as simple as possible, that has a pitch so that it sheds water rather than a flat roof which grabs water and it eventually might leak. Complex roofs are the most common problem. In fact, there have been architects that were quoted that if a roof doesn't leak, it's too boring. One of the most fantastic ideas that Brand proposes is a house logbook. Imagine you start building a house and you install all of the services, electricity, pipes, and plumbing, and anything else that you want to add, and you close up the walls, and then you want to change something. How do you know where all the services are? You can poke holes. There are some wiring finders, but the way to solve this problem once and for all is logbook. When you start building, you take pictures of the locations of where the structure is, where the services are, and anytime you make changes, you add to the logbook. For example, you paint walls with a certain color and a few years pass by and you damage that wall and you want to repaint just a certain section of it. How do you know what color you used? You open up the logbook and there you go. It's just brilliant. And if you want to drill some holes in the wall and you're worried that you're going to hit an electricity cable, how do you know how to avoid it? You open up your logbook, you look at your pictures that you've taken initially, and there you have it. I've done this a couple of times and it saved my rear end because I wanted to hang a floating shelf on a wall and I knew I had installed some wiring in that wall prior to it. And how did I know where to put it? I looked at the pictures that I've taken when I was putting new wiring in the wall. It just works. It's just such a great idea. Okay, and some other great ideas. Exposed services. Maybe don't even close them off. Maybe make them look neat so that you know and can access those services and change anything super easily. Another idea is, if you want a big building to last many years, how do you make the structure, the most foundational thing, good? You use materials like brick, or you build a timber frame house. You use timber frame because the way the timber frame is designed is the timbers are on the inside of the house and then the skin goes around the outside of the timber frame, protecting the frame essentially. After 30 years you can repair the skin or replace the skin, but the frame can last up to 300 years. Timber frames are known to last many years. The initial drawing of your construction should be different from the final product, because as you go through the process, you realize, oh, actually, I want this to be that way versus this way, because once you're inside of the space tells you how to design and you adapt the space to your liking. So initial drawings should never be the same as the final result, but the final result should be documented in the logbook. Another idea that I don't think is very common in construction yet is called transparency of damage, and that's when materials are used where if there's water damage, if there's some kind of damage, you see it before it starts damaging the structure of the house. That way you save the building from complete failure. And one of the curious inventions that Stewart Brand proposes in the book is for manufacturers to create materials that smell bad when they get wet. That way they warn the occupants that there is something wrong with the building. Wouldn't that be brilliant? It's just so simple, but why doesn't that happen right now? Why not? I have one more quote here for you. Trust, intimacy, intense use, and time are what made these buildings work so well. They are not distinguished looking. What such buildings have instead is an offhand, haphazard, seeming mastery and layers upon layers of soul. They embody all the meanings of the word mature, experienced, complex, subtle, wise, savvy, idiosyncratic, partly hidden, resilient, and set in their ways. Time has taught them, and they teach us. So here we are. If you have any interest in buildings, I urge you to check out this book. And if you enjoyed this video, you might enjoy a video where I review a whole bunch of books that I read in the past year that have made me a better maker, which you can check out just over here. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.